The mountain roads twisted like snakes as I made the final ascent to Grandpa Harold's cabin. My hands ached from gripping the steering wheel for 12 hours straight from Charlotte. The GPS had lost signal 2 miles back, but I didn't need it. Some things you never forget, even after 8 years away. I pulled into the gravel driveway, rocks crunching under my tires. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. Weathered cedar siding with a sagging porch that wrapped around the front. The flower beds my grandmother had once tended were now wild tangles of weeds. When I cut the engine, the silence rushed in. No traffic noise, no neighbors' music, just wind through pine trees and distant bird calls. I sat there a minute, gathering myself. Coming back wasn't my first choice, but what else could I do? Cancer didn't care about old arguments or the life I'd built in the city. I grabbed my duffel from the passenger seat and headed up the porch steps. They creaked under my weight. Before I could knock, the door swung open. "Took you long enough," Grandpa Harold said. He was a shadow of the man I remembered. His ranger uniform hung from a coat hook behind him, pressed and ready, but he wore flannel pajamas instead. His face had hollowed, skin stretched tight across cheekbones that matched mine. The oxygen tube looped under his nose, connected to a tank he pulled behind him like an obedient pet. "Traffic on I-40, I said, which wasn't entirely true. I'd stopped twice just to work up the courage to continue. He nodded like he knew I was lying. "Come in, coffee's hot." The inside of the cabin smelled like pine, coffee, and something medicinal. Every surface held reminders of his career, framed photos of mountain landscapes, carved wooden bears, awards for decades of service to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. A wall map bristled with colored pins marking trails he'd patrolled. We drank coffee at the kitchen table, the conversation stiff and formal at first. How was the drive? How was my job at the bank? Did I still have that girlfriend? What was her name? "Sarah," I said. "We broke up last year." He grunted. "Never thought you'd end up pushing papers in a bank." "It pays the bills," I said, though the truth was I hated it. Nothing like the future my younger self had imagined while hiking these mountains with him years ago. As evening fell, I made dinner with supplies I'd bought on the way. He ate little, mostly pushing food around his plate. When he coughed, it came from deep inside, a wet, terrible sound that made me wince. "Doctors give me a month," he said when the coughing subsided. "But they don't know these mountains like I do. 3 days, maybe 4. I started to protest, but the certainty in his eyes stopped me. "That's why you're here," he continued. "Things I need to tell you, things about the park." "The park?" I set down my fork. "Grandpa, I don't— 40 years as a ranger," he cut in. "Saw things that don't make sense, things not in any training manual." I thought of the medical bottles on his bedside table. Pain meds, strong ones. "Let's talk in the morning," I suggested. "You should rest." But morning brought more of the same. After a breakfast he barely touched, he pulled out journals, dozens of them filled with cramped handwriting and crude sketches. "The park has rules," he said, flipping through pages. "Not the ones they post at trailheads, different rules, ones that keep you alive." He talked for hours, about voices that called from places where no hiker had been reported missing, about rangers who looked right but moved wrong, red scarves tied to trees as warnings rather than trail markers, stone piles that rebuilt themselves when no one was looking. I nodded and made appropriate noises, but inside my heart broke. This wasn't the sharp-minded man who taught me to track deer and identify edible plants. This was the ravings of someone whose mind was slipping alongside his body. The pattern repeated the next day and the next. Between coughing fits and naps, he kept returning to his warnings. I started taking notes just to humor him. "Don't listen to voices calling for help unless you can see who's calling. Never approach another ranger if they won't turn to face you. Red scarves on trees mean turn back immediately. If you see a pile of stones on the trail, kick it apart. If it rebuilds itself, run. Stay on marked trails after sunset, no matter what you see or hear." On the 4th morning, I woke to unusual quiet, no coughing from his bedroom. I made coffee, the ritual calming my suddenly racing thoughts. When it was ready, I carried 2 mugs to the living room where he'd taken to sleeping in his old recliner. The morning light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes in the air. Grandpa sat in his chair, head tilted slightly, eyes open but seeing nothing. His oxygen tank hissed softly beside him. In his right hand, clutched in fingers gone stiff, was a piece of paper. I set the coffee down and checked his pulse, though I already knew. His skin felt cool, waxy. I gently worked the paper from his fingers. It was a list, handwritten in shaky script. 1. Never respond to a call for help unless you can see who's calling. 2. Do not approach other rangers if they refuse to face you directly. 3. Red scarves tied to trees are warnings. Turn around immediately. 4. If you find a pile of stones on the trail, kick it apart. If it rebuilds itself, run. 5. Stay on marked trails after dark. What looks like a shortcut never is. At the bottom, he'd signed his name, Harold Campbell, the letters trembling across the page. I sat on the arm of his chair, the list in my hand, and looked at the man who'd taught me everything I knew about these mountains. Even as a kid, I'd recognized his respect for the wilderness wasn't just professional, it bordered on reverence or sometimes fear. Now I understood why. He'd lost his grip on reality at the end, seeing threats and monsters in the same forests he'd patrolled for decades. The disease hadn't just eaten his lungs, it had taken his mind too. I called the local funeral home. They knew him well. Small communities are like that, and promised to send someone right away. While I waited, I packed his ranger uniform into the closet and straightened the journals scattered across the coffee table. The funeral director arrived with an assistant. They were efficient and respectful, asking few questions. As they prepared to take his body, I stood on the porch, needing fresh air. The mountains stretched before me, misty blue waves rolling to the horizon, beautiful but indifferent to the grief of one man on a wooden porch. Somewhere in those forests, Grandpa had lost himself to fears I couldn't understand. When I went back inside, the house felt emptier than a place has any right to feel. I folded the list he'd died holding and shoved it into my jacket pocket, a crumpled memorial to paranoia. Tomorrow I'd call his lawyer and start the process of settling his affairs. For now, I just needed to get through the evening in a house full of ghosts that existed only in my grandfather's mind. I stood outside the ranger station 2 days after watching them lower Grandpa Harold into the ground. The building looked exactly as I remembered from childhood visits, a sturdy log structure with a sloped roof and wide front porch. Back then, I'd wait eagerly while Grandpa finished his paperwork, my child-sized junior ranger hat perched proudly on my head. Now I hesitated at the base of the steps, my hand touching the folded paper in my jacket pocket. Despite knowing better, I couldn't bring myself to throw away the list of rules Grandpa had clutched in his final moments. Maybe keeping it was my way of honoring him, even if the contents were nonsense born from pain medication and failing lungs. The door swung open before I could knock. James Mitchell stood in the doorway, looking exactly as Grandpa had described him years ago. Trim build, military-style haircut now peppered with gray, and a uniform so pristine it might have been pressed 5 minutes ago. "Dylan Campbell," he said, extending his hand. "You look like your grandfather." His grip was firm but not aggressive. I followed him inside, where the smell of coffee and pine cleaner filled the air. The station's main room held 3 desks, a wall of radios, and topographical maps covering every available surface. A bulletin board displayed missing person flyers, weather warnings, and trail closure notices. "Harold spoke highly of you," James said, gesturing toward a chair beside his desk. "Said you knew these mountains better than most rangers with 10 years' experience." I almost laughed. That was a long time ago. "Like riding a bike," James replied, settling into his own chair. "Some things you don't forget." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer and opened it. Inside were employment forms, tax paperwork, and what looked like a contract. "I'll be straight with you," he continued. "We're short-staffed heading into spring season. Harold's position hasn't been permanently filled. The Park Service moves slower than molasses with new hires." I watched as he arranged the papers in neat stacks. "I can offer you temporary employment," he said. 3 months, maybe longer if things work out. Gives you income while you handle Harold's affairs, and gives me an experienced set of eyes on the trails." "I work at First National in Charlotte," I said automatically. James raised an eyebrow. "Called them yesterday. Your grandfather listed me as his emergency contact. They're holding your position for family bereavement leave." Of course, Grandpa had arranged everything. Even dying, he'd planned 10 steps ahead. "The pay isn't great," James added, "but the cabin comes with the job. No rent to worry about." I thought about my apartment in Charlotte, the monthly parking fees that cost more than a car payment, the soul-crushing fluorescent lights of the bank. Then I looked out the window at the mountains rising in blue-green waves, morning mist still clinging to their slopes. "When would I start?" I asked. "Today," James said, sliding the paperwork toward me. "Nothing complicated, just a standard patrol of the Appalachian Trail section between Newfound Gap and Charlie's Bunyan. Get reacquainted with the territory." 2 hours later, I stood at the trailhead wearing my grandfather's spare uniform. James had found it in the station's locker room, still bearing Harold Campbell's name tag. The pants were slightly short and the shirt tight across my shoulders, but it felt right somehow. The April air carried the scent of new growth, mountain laurel, wild azaleas preparing to bloom, and the rich earthiness of soil warming after winter. I checked my pack one last time: radio, first aid kit, trail maps, water, energy bars, rain jacket, basic equipment for a 6-hour patrol. The trail stretched before me, a familiar ribbon winding through ancient forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with the breeze. For the first time since arriving back in Tennessee, the tightness in my chest eased slightly. I walked at a steady pace, stopping occasionally to help hikers with directions or answer questions about local wildlife. The routine felt familiar, though I hadn't done this work since college summers spent as a seasonal guide. By midday, I'd covered nearly 5 miles, passing through stands of tulip poplars and hemlocks, their trunks massive from centuries of growth. The encounter happened just past the halfway point of my patrol route. I'd stopped to drink water when something cut through the ambient forest sounds. A woman's voice, distant but clear enough to make out words. "Help, please, somebody help me." I lowered my water bottle, listening. The forest had gone suddenly, completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant murmur of hikers on the trail. "Is anyone there? I'm hurt. Please help." The voice came from somewhere off the trail to my right, maybe 100 yards through dense undergrowth. I took a step toward it, then stopped. My hand moved to my pocket, fingers finding the folded paper. Rule number 1, never respond to a call for help unless you can see who's calling. I stood frozen, rational thought battling with instinct. It was broad daylight. Someone could be injured. This was literally my job, helping people in the park. Yet something felt wrong. The unnatural silence. The voice that sounded somehow too perfect, like an actor reading lines rather than someone in genuine distress. "Please, I can hear you on the trail. I'm over here." I unclipped my radio. "Base, this is Campbell. I'm hearing a possible distress call near mile marker 17. Female voice off trail, requesting guidance." Static crackled before James responded. "Copy that. Any visual confirmation?" "Negative," I replied, voice only. A pause. "Maintain position on marked trail. I'll dispatch back up to your location." The voice called twice more, each time sounding closer despite me not moving toward it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The forest sounds gradually returned. The whisper of wind through trees, bird calls, the rustle of small animals in underbrush. I waited 20 minutes, but backup never arrived. When I radioed again, James seemed confused. "What backup? You never called in a distress signal." "Yes, I did," I insisted. "About 20 minutes ago." Female voice off trail. "Campbell, this is the first communication I've received from you since your midday check-in. Are you feeling all right?" I stared at the radio, then at the silent forest around me. "Yeah, must have been radio malfunction. Never mind." I continued my patrol with a growing sense of unease. The rational part of my brain constructed explanations. A hiker who found her own way out, a radio that failed to transmit, exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But deeper down, something else was taking root. The uncomfortable possibility that Grandpa's rules weren't delusions. 3 hours later, near Cataract Falls, I rounded a bend in the trail and stopped abruptly. Tied around the trunk of an oak tree directly ahead was a bright red scarf. The fabric stood out vividly against the dark bark, its color so intense it seemed to vibrate in the late afternoon light. Rule number 3, red scarves tied to trees are warnings. Turn around immediately. I approached slowly, examining the scarf. It looked new, the material unworn by weather or time. No sign indicated who had placed it there or why. Nothing about the location seemed inherently dangerous, just a typical section of forest along a well-maintained trail. Yet my skin prickled with goosebumps. That same wrongness I'd felt earlier returned, stronger now. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper than they should have been given the time of day. I turned around and began walking back the way I'd come. At the first trail junction, I took an alternate route that would loop back to the parking area. It meant an extra 2 miles of hiking, but something told me it was worth the detour. The sun was setting by the time I reached my truck. I changed out of the uniform in the small staff restroom, my hands shaking slightly as I folded the borrowed clothes. As I drove back toward the ranger station, my mind churned with questions I had no answers for. James was locking up when I arrived. I handed him my patrol report, deliberately vague about why I'd taken the longer return route. "How'd it feel being back out there?" he asked, tucking the paperwork under his arm. "Familiar," I said, "like no time passed at all." He nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would be pleased. Same shift tomorrow." I hesitated only briefly. "I'll be here." Driving back to the cabin in twilight, I couldn't stop thinking about the voice in the woods and that vivid red scarf. Coincidences, surely. Yet I found myself reviewing the other rules on Grandpa's list, wondering what I might encounter next. The rational explanation was that grief was making me see connections where none existed. But another part of me, the part that grew up in these mountains, learning their secrets at my grandfather's side, whispered that there might be things in these ancient forests that defied rational explanation. I parked outside the cabin and sat in the darkness for several minutes, listening to the evening sounds of the mountains. Whatever the truth, I had committed to 3 months here. Time enough to settle Grandpa's affairs, and perhaps to discover whether his final warnings had been delusions or something else entirely. I woke before dawn in my grandfather's cabin, the old floorboards creaking as I moved around the kitchen making coffee. Sleep had come in short bursts, interrupted by dreams of red scarves tied to trees and voices calling from empty woods. Each time I woke, the cabin's darkness pressed in around me, making the hair on my neck stand up until I switched on a lamp. By the time first light appeared, I'd already dressed in my borrowed ranger uniform and packed my gear for the day. The coffee tasted bitter and burnt despite measuring the grounds carefully. As I rinsed the mug, I caught myself glancing repeatedly at the kitchen window, watching the trees at the edge of the property as if expecting something to emerge from them. This was ridiculous. I was a grown man jumping at shadows because of coincidences and an old man's delusions, yet I still tucked the folded paper with Grandpa's rules into my shirt pocket before heading out. The drive to Elkmont took 20 minutes along winding roads that hugged the mountainside. Morning fog clung to the valleys below, transforming the landscape into something dreamlike and unfamiliar. I parked at the ranger station, checked in with the morning staff, and collected my radio and daily assignment from the duty board. Elkmont to Cades Cove, I muttered, tracing the route on my map. A relatively easy patrol along established trails, nothing too strenuous, perfect for my second day back on the job. The early hours passed uneventfully. I helped a family with a map who had taken a wrong turn, reminded a couple about proper food storage techniques in bear country, and picked up scattered trash from a careless camper. The normalcy was reassuring after yesterday's strange encounters. Around noon, I stopped at a small clearing to eat lunch. The April sun filtered through new spring leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds called from the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance, water rushed over rocks. I finished my sandwich and was about to continue when I noticed a figure on the trail ahead. Another ranger walked about 200 yards up the path, moving at a steady pace away from me. The standard issue green and gray uniform was unmistakable, as was the campaign hat that all Park Service employees wore. Something about the figure's movements caught my attention. A stiffness in the shoulders, an unusual precision in each step. I closed my backpack and stood, brushing crumbs from my pants. "Hey there," I called out, my voice carrying through the quiet forest. The figure continued walking, giving no indication they'd heard me. I started walking, raising my voice. "Park Service, hold up a minute." Still no response. The distance between us remained exactly the same despite my increasing pace. The ranger never turned around, never acknowledged my calls, just kept walking with that same mechanical precision. I frowned and picked up my pace. Perhaps they had earbuds in, technically against regulations while on duty, but not uncommon. As I walked faster, the figure ahead matched my speed perfectly. When I slowed briefly to navigate a rocky section, they slowed too, maintaining that precise 200-yard gap. Something cold settled in my stomach. This wasn't right. No one could maintain such exact distance without looking back once to check. "Last chance," I shouted, breaking into a jog. "I need to speak with you." The figure ahead started jogging too, their movements unnaturally smooth. No head bob, no arms swinging naturally. Just that same mechanical gait at a faster pace. I pushed harder, breaking into a run. The trail curved through a stand of hemlocks, momentarily blocking my view. When I rounded the bend, I expected to see the mysterious ranger just ahead. The trail was empty. I stopped, breathing hard more from surprise than exertion. The path stretched out before me, visible for at least half a mile through relatively open forest. No side trails branched off here. No large rocks or trees provided hiding places. The other ranger had simply vanished. "What the hell?" I muttered, turning in a complete circle. The forest seemed to hold its breath. No birds called, no leaves rustled. The sudden silence pressed against my ears like physical pressure. I took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the ground. The trail here was muddy from recent rain, and clear footprints marked the soft earth, my own fresh ones coming from behind, and another set leading forward. The other prints were from standard issue Park Service boots, identical to mine. I followed them, noting their regular spacing and unusual depth. Whoever made them had been heavy or carrying something substantial. 20 yards ahead, the footprints stopped. Not gradually, as if someone had carefully stepped off the trail. Not veering right or left as if taking another path. The tracks simply ended in the middle of the mud, as if their owner had dissolved into thin air. I crouched down, examining the last print. It was a complete impression. Heel, arch, toe, not a partial step or smudge. Beyond it, the mud showed no disturbance at all. My radio crackled, making me jump. "Campbell, this is Base, checking in on your noon status." I unclipped the radio with shaking fingers. "Base, this is Campbell, I'm at." I checked my map. Mile marker 22 on the Elkmont Trail. "Copy that. Everything okay? You sound tense." I hesitated, looking at the impossible footprints. "James, are there any other rangers patrolling this section today?" A brief pause. "Negative. You're solo on that route. Why?" "I just thought I saw another ranger up ahead. Couldn't catch up to verify." "Definitely not one of ours," James replied. "Might be state forestry or wildlife management. They sometimes use our trails for their surveys." The explanation made sense, perfect sense, except for the vanishing footprints and the figure's strange, mechanical movements. "Right," I said. "Probably wildlife management. Need backup?" James asked, his tone shifting to concern. No, I'm good. Just checking. Campbell out. I clipped the radio back to my belt and stood staring at those abruptly ending footprints. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, as if holding secrets just beyond my understanding. My hand moved to my shirt pocket, fingers finding the folded paper. I pulled it out and carefully unfolded it, smoothing the wrinkles as best I could. My eyes went immediately to the second rule on the list. Do not approach other rangers if they refuse to face you directly. The paper trembled slightly in my hand. 2 days on the job, and I'd already encountered 3 of the 5 situations my grandfather had warned about. The voice calling for help without a visible source, the red scarf tied to a tree, and now a ranger who wouldn't turn around. I refolded the paper and returned it to my pocket. My hands shook as I adjusted my pack and looked once more at those impossible footprints. Whatever I'd been following, it wasn't a state forestry worker or wildlife manager. It wasn't human at all. The silence broke as a woodpecker drummed against a distant tree. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned, like musicians taking their places after an unexpected intermission. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to decide what to do next. Logic said to continue my patrol. I had a job to do, miles to cover before returning to my truck, but the footprints ending in the middle of the trail kept drawing my gaze, challenging everything I thought I knew about the world. I remained frozen in place for several minutes, staring at those footprints that ended impossibly in the middle of the muddy trail. The forest had returned to its normal sounds around me, birds calling, leaves rustling, but nothing felt normal anymore. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe the other ranger had jumped from the trail. Maybe there was a rock I couldn't see. Maybe I was losing my mind. None of those explanations felt right. I took a deep breath and continued my patrol, constantly looking over my shoulder and jumping at every snapped twig or animal call. The weight of my grandfather's folded note pressed against my chest through my shirt pocket, no longer feeling like a memento of his paranoia but something far more important. By mid-afternoon, I'd finished my assigned route and radioed back to base. Campbell to base. I've completed the Elkmont section. James's voice crackled back. Good timing. I need someone to check Chimney Top's trail before end of day. Had reports of downed branches after last night's wind. You up for it? I hesitated. The strange encounters had left me rattled, and part of me wanted to retreat to the safety of the ranger station. Campbell? You there? Yeah, I said finally. I can handle Chimney Tops. Good man. Just a quick sweep to make sure the path is clear. Call in when you're done. I drove to the Chimney Tops trailhead, one of the more popular hiking spots in the park. The parking area was half full, mostly day hikers enjoying the pleasant spring weather. I grabbed my pack from the passenger seat, checked my water supply, and headed up the trail. The path to Chimney Tops was steep but well maintained, climbing over 2 miles to reach dramatic rock formations that gave the site its name. Families with children and casual hikers passed me on their way down, many of them nodding respectfully at my uniform. I forced myself to smile and nod back, playing the role of the confident park ranger while internally still shaken by what I'd seen earlier. About a mile up the trail, the day hikers thinned out. The path narrowed as it wound through a section of old-growth forest, tall hemlocks and tulip poplars creating a cathedral-like canopy overhead. I paused to remove a few small branches that had fallen across the trail, tossing them into the underbrush. As I rounded a bend in the trail, I stopped abruptly. In the middle of the path, perfectly centered where no hiker could miss it, stood a pile of stones stacked into a neat pyramid. The formation rose to about knee height, with larger rocks forming a solid base and progressively smaller stones balanced on top, culminating in a single small white quartz pebble. I stared at the stack, my mouth going dry. This wasn't unusual in itself. Hikers often built cairns like this, but something about its perfect placement and precise construction made my skin crawl. The stones fit together too neatly, as if shaped specifically to create this structure. My hand moved to my shirt pocket automatically, pulling out the now familiar paper. I unfolded it with trembling fingers and read the 4th rule. If you see stones piled together on a trail, kick them apart. If they move back on their own, run. I looked from the paper to the stone pyramid and back again. This was ridiculous. Stones didn't reassemble themselves. It defied the laws of physics, of reality itself. Yet the voice without a source had been real. The ranger who wouldn't turn around had been real. The red scarf had been real. I took a deep breath, folded the paper, and returned it to my pocket. Then I stepped forward and kicked the stone pile hard, sending rocks flying in all directions. Several larger stones tumbled down the slope beside the trail, while smaller pebbles scattered across the dirt path. The white quartz pebble from the top landed near my boot. I picked it up, examined its smooth surface, then tossed it far into the underbrush. Satisfied, I continued up the trail, breathing a little easier. Just another coincidence. Just another. After walking about 50 feet, some instinct made me turn around and look back. The stone pyramid stood in the middle of the trail, exactly as before. Perfect. Undisturbed, complete with the white quartz pebble on top. No, I whispered, feeling cold spread through my chest. No, that's not possible. I jogged back to the pile, circling it slowly. These had to be different stones. The ones I'd kicked away were still gone, and someone else had built an identical stack in the same spot. Except there was no one else on this section of trail. And the white quartz pebble on top, I'd thrown it far into the brush. I'd watched it disappear among the ferns and fallen leaves. My breath came faster as I stared at the impossible structure. I kicked it again, harder this time, putting my whole body into the motion. Stones flew in all directions, some landing several yards away. I made sure every single rock was cleared from the trail, then deliberately walked over the spot where the pyramid had stood, scuffing the dirt with my boots to erase any trace of its foundation. This time I jogged 100 yards up the trail, moving quickly around 2 bends until I was certain I'd left the spot far behind. The path climbed steeply here, and sweat beaded on my forehead from exertion and fear. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I waited several minutes before turning around. Part of me didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what some deep instinct told me I would see. Finally, I turned. The pyramid stood on the trail behind me, perfectly reconstructed. Same height, same arrangement, same white quartz pebble gleaming on top. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead and down my back. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees suddenly too close, too watchful. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. If they move back on their own, run. I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted up the trail, my boots pounding against dirt and rock. My breath came in gasping gulps as I pushed myself harder, faster, driven by a primal fear I couldn't rationalize away. Physical laws had been broken, reality had bent, and whatever force could reassemble stones without being seen was something I had no desire to encounter. I didn't stop running until I reached the parking area, my lungs burning and legs shaking. I stumbled to my truck and yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and locking the doors with trembling hands. Only then did I let myself look back toward the trailhead, half expecting to see a stone pyramid materializing in the middle of the asphalt. The parking lot remained normal. Tourists loaded their cars. A family ate sandwiches at a picnic table. Nothing seemed out of place. My radio crackled to life on my belt. Base to Campbell. Status update on Chimney Tops Trail. I unclipped the radio, trying to steady my breathing enough to speak. My mind raced through possible responses. What could I possibly say? That I'd run from a pile of rocks that magically reassembled itself? That the laws of physics didn't apply in certain parts of the park? Campbell, do you copy? I pressed the talk button. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again. I'm at the parking area. Trail is... I paused, searching for words. Trail has some issues. What kind of issues? James asked, his tone sharpening with concern. Need backup? I stared out the windshield at the normal, everyday scene of the parking lot, trying to reconcile it with what I'd just experienced. Campbell, talk to me. What's happening? What could I say? How could I explain? The truth would sound like madness, like a mental breakdown, yet lying felt impossible too. I'll explain when I get back to base, I managed finally. On my way now. I started the truck with shaking hands, the engine's rumble providing small comfort as I pulled out of the parking space. In my rearview mirror, the trailhead to Chimney Tops grew smaller, but the memory of those impossibly moving stones remained large in my mind. My grandfather hadn't been crazy. He hadn't been suffering from delusions or medication side effects. He'd been trying to prepare me for a reality I would never have believed without experiencing it myself. I pressed the accelerator harder, eager to put distance between myself and the trail, while knowing I couldn't outrun the realization that everything had changed. The world I thought I understood had rules I'd never imagined. Rules my grandfather had spent 40 years learning. Rules he'd tried to pass on to me before it was too late. I hardly slept that night. Every creak in the cabin's old wood made me flinch, and twice I got up to check the windows, half expecting to see a stone pyramid on the porch or a figure standing motionless in the yard. When my alarm went off at 5:30, I'd been staring at the ceiling for over an hour, turning yesterday's impossible events over in my mind. The drive to the ranger station that morning felt different. I noticed things I'd overlooked before, how certain sections of forest seemed darker than they should be, how some areas felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. These mountains had been my childhood playground, but now they seemed to hide secrets in every shadow. James looked up from his computer when I walked in. Morning, Campbell. Got you on the Klingman's Dome route today. He slid a clipboard across the desk. Trail crews reported some issues with... Actually, I cut in, my voice steadier than I expected. I was hoping to stay closer to base today. Maybe patrol the visitor centers, check the restrooms, that sort of thing. James raised an eyebrow. That's custodial work. We've got staff for that. I know, but I searched for a plausible reason that wouldn't sound like I was terrified of the forest. I twisted my ankle a bit yesterday on chimney tops. Nothing serious, but I'd rather not push it on the steep trails. He studied my face for a moment. I tried to look appropriately pained rather than scared out of my mind. Fine, he said finally. Sugarland Center needs a presence anyway. Lot of tourists this week with spring break. He made a note on his clipboard. Check the facilities, answer questions, make sure nobody's feeding the wildlife in the parking lot. Standard stuff. I nodded, relief washing through me. Thanks, James. He looked up again, his expression unreadable. Those issues you mentioned yesterday on chimney tops. Anything I should know about? Just some downed branches, I lied. I cleared what I could, but a couple sections might need the trail crew. James nodded and returned to his computer. I gathered my gear and left before he could ask any more questions. The drive to Sugarland's visitor center took 20 minutes. The large stone and timber building served as the main information hub for the park's west side, with museum exhibits, a bookstore, and rangers offering guided programs. The parking lot was already half full when I arrived, mostly minivans and SUVs with out-of-state plates. I spent the morning checking restrooms, picking up trash, and answering endless tourist questions about bears, hiking trails, and where to find the best views. The normalcy was comforting. Here among families with fanny packs and cameras, reality seemed solid and predictable. No voices called without sources, no footprints ended in the middle of trails, no stone piles reassembled themselves when my back was turned. Around noon, I sat on a bench outside eating my lunch, watching children chase each other across the grass while their parents studied park maps. An elderly couple asked me about wheelchair-accessible trails, and I directed them to the Sugarlands Valley Nature Trail, drawing them a little map on a napkin. When they left, I leaned back and took a deep breath. Maybe I could make it through today without anything weird happening. Maybe whatever forces operated in the remote sections of the park didn't reach this far into the developed areas. After finishing my sandwich, I made another round through the building, checking that the restrooms were clean and stocked. As I walked back into the main lobby, I noticed a park ranger standing near the information kiosks, facing away from me. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Standard uniform, campaign hat, perfect posture. But something about the way he stood, too still, too rigid, triggered an alarm in my mind. I approached slowly. "Hey there," I called. "Don't think we've met. I'm Dylan Campbell, new transfer." The ranger didn't respond or turn around. He remained perfectly motionless, like a mannequin in a display. The visitors seemed to be giving him a wide berth, flowing around him as if he were just another exhibit. I moved closer, circling to see his face. "Excuse me?" When I saw his profile, my step faltered. His skin was wrong, too pale, almost waxy, like a department store dummy. As I came around to face him directly, I saw his eyes completely black, without whites or pupils, like empty holes in his face. He stared straight ahead, unblinking. His uniform was pristine, not a wrinkle or speck of dust visible. The name tag on his shirt read, Ranger, with no actual name. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. His head turned toward me with mechanical precision, rotating too smoothly, like it wasn't connected to a human neck. Our eyes met, my human ones and his empty black pools, and something cold slithered down my spine. I took a step back. The thing, because I knew now it wasn't human, took a step forward. Its movements were fluid but wrong, like someone wearing a human suit that didn't quite fit. "I need to check something," I said, backing away further. The ranger's mouth began to open, slowly at first, then wider and wider, stretching beyond what any human jaw could manage. The mouth kept opening until it split the lower half of the face, revealing row after row of pointed teeth, like a shark's but more numerous, extending deep into an impossibly dark throat. A child nearby screamed, but the sound seemed distant through the rushing in my ears. The creature took another step toward me, mouth still stretched in that impossible grin. I turned and ran. Through the lobby, past startled tourists, out the front doors, and into the parking lot. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, fumbling with the keys before yanking the door open and locking myself inside. My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before getting them into the ignition. I started the engine but didn't drive away, just sat there with my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd seen. Through the windshield, I watched the visitor center entrance. Tourists came and went. Families took photos. No one seemed panicked. No one was running from a monster with too many teeth. Had anyone else seen it? Had that child's scream been coincidence? Or was the thing inside visible only to me, for some reason I couldn't understand? My chest rose and fell with rapid breaths as I tried to calm down. My grandfather's list. I needed to check it again. With trembling fingers, I pulled the folded paper from my shirt pocket. The creases were getting worn from so much handling, the paper softening like cloth. I smoothed it on the steering wheel and read through the rules again. 1. Never respond to a call for help unless you can see who's calling. 2. Do not approach other rangers if they refuse to face you directly. 3. Red scarves tied to trees are warnings. Turn around immediately. 4. If you see stones piled together on a trail, kick them apart. If they move back on their own, run. 5. Stay on marked trails after dark. What looks like a shortcut never is. The voice in the woods, the ranger who wouldn't turn around, the red scarf, the self-assembling stone pile, and now, this thing with its too wide mouth and inhuman teeth. Every warning, every rule on my grandfather's list had proven true. I stared at the paper, no longer seeing it as the ramblings of a dying man but as something precious and vital, a survival guide passed down by someone who had learned these lessons the hard way. Over 40 years in these mountains, my grandfather had encountered these phenomena repeatedly, cataloged them, learned how to avoid them, and tried to pass that knowledge to me, and I had dismissed it all as medication-induced paranoia. I folded the list carefully and returned it to my shirt pocket right above my heart. From now on, I would carry it with me every single day. I would memorize every word. I would add to it if necessary. Because whatever lived in these mountains, whatever forces or entities operated beyond the normal rules of reality, they were real. And understanding them wasn't just about satisfying curiosity, it was about staying alive. The radio on my belt crackled. Base to Campbell. Everything okay at Sugarlands? I picked up the radio, trying to steady my voice. Campbell here. Everything's... I looked at the visitor center where tourists continued their normal activities. No sign of the thing I'd encountered. Everything's fine. Good. Finish your shift there and head back to base for end-of-day briefing. Copy that, I replied, clipping the radio back to my belt. I sat in my truck for 5 more minutes, gathering my courage to return to the visitor center. The list in my pocket felt heavier now, weighted with truth and responsibility. My grandfather had tried to prepare me. Now I needed to honor that preparation by surviving whatever came next.